But yeah, all right, let's get started. So, second slide today. I'm going to go over some history, just to give you a bit of context, some stuff to do with what's happened in audio over the past, almost 200 years, 150 years at least. I'm going to go over how we hear, seems pretty essential, and once we know a bit about how our ears work and how our brain works, I'm going to talk about what mono is, what stereo is, what surround sound is, and then I'm going to give you guys kind of an overview of different advantages and disadvantages of those, so you can kind of make a well-constructed argument for what's best. I'm not going on about air sound in this week, I'll do that in the last week, but that will certainly tie it all together in the last week. And then finally I'm going to talk about what MP3, CD, Bluetooth and so on, basically lossless versus lossy audio codecs lastly today. So slide 3, here's a list of relatively important dates. There are hundreds more. I mean, the thing is the whole list is pretty crazy. There's a really good list on the Audio Engineering Society website if you're interested. I've highlighted a few key dates in bold here. So starting off in 1877 was when Edison recorded Mary's Little Lamb on a cylinder. You can still hear that recording, I think. In 1877, Bell creates the first electric loudspeaker. This is basically the only reason why I've got a job at the moment for Orbit Sound, because if that hadn't been invented, and certainly in 1915, the Jensen first moving coil loudspeaker, my job is primarily to design the actual transducers, the moving coil drivers that are in the products. So other key dates, moving on, you can check through these in your own time if you're interested. 1931, I've got Blumlein patenting stereo. So this was at EMI Abbey Road in London, and this was the birth of stereo as we know it today. Before that we had mono, and then Blumlein patented the first creation of stereo, and we'll go on to describe what setup that entailed. Next key date, I've got 1981, Philips created CD. CD was amazing. I've got nothing but just completely in awe for what Philips did with CD. It's the epitomization of basically an audio format that described the requirements fully of human hearing. It's a benchmark in terms of quality, and it still is today, even though we've got these high definition audio file formats and recording formats. There's been no scientific evidence to suggest that people can actually hear the difference between a CD and audio file formats that are higher quality than that. So I know Neil Young brought in Pono recently. Pono, his attempt to get high definition audio to the masses, I think it's pretty much failed. It keeps making sort of small resurgences, but then it disappears again. But yeah, we keep coming back to CD quality. So it's, key date definitely. 1987, I've got the first commercial instance of 5.1 surround sound being used at Moulin Rouge in France. And I guess the other key dates that I haven't put on here are the key dates for Orbit Sound introducing the sound bars. So skipping on to the next slide, I've got a picture of a lake here. It may seem a bit random, but basically this is a big lake, and there's boats in it, there's fish in it, there's fishermen fishing in it, there's swimmers swimming in it, and birds and ducks and all sorts. So there's also a wind that's creating waves in addition to the waves that are created by all of the things in the lake. And obviously the waves in that big lake, they're going to be hugely complex, but they're going to be determined and could be calculated if we knew exactly what was going on in that lake. So in other words, if there was nothing going on and if there was no wind, there would be no waves, and the lake would be totally placid. But there's plenty of waves, and we've got these two little ponds off to the left-hand side, and these are supposed to be analogous to our ears. The two tributaries that feed those two ponds allow waves to travel from the bigger lake to the smaller ponds. And what our ears are essentially doing is working out what's in the lake by looking at the waves in each of the two ponds. So it's an insanely complicated task. Seems ridiculous and impossible, but that is effectively what our ears are doing. So our brains are highly evolved to take in waves that are chaotic and all over the place into each of our ears, and from the independent information in our ears and also the combined information from each of our ears, we're able to kind of discern what we're listening to. So I know when Rich is speaking on the phone, for instance, because I recognise his voice. I might be in a party and there might be 60 or so people there or more, whatever, and there'll be sound of music. Everyone will be having independent conversations. Just so much going on, and yet I will still be able to hold quite comfortably a conversation, assuming it's not too loud, with someone who's in front of me because my ears and my brain will be able to recognize their voice. So our ears are highly evolved in certainly with the way they work with our brain in order to distinguish what's going on. So quite amazing organs. Our eyes are also well evolved, and in some senses more well evolved than our ears. Evolutionarily, they're a more important organ than our ears are. Our sight is more important, is what I mean. But still, quite an amazing task. So if we move on to the next slide, apart from all that stuff to do with psychoacoustics, which is, it's just a whole world in itself, there are some key things that I think we should know about, certainly when it comes to describing how we localize sound. And what I mean by that is, if I'm in a room and someone's talking off to my right, how do I know where they are in the room if I haven't got my eyes open, for instance? And in fact, even with my eyes open, you'll find that you can quite easily tell that you can work out the difference, the distance, and also the direction from which the sound is coming from. So the way we do that is by using auditory localization cues. Sounds a bit of a mouthful, but it's not too bad. If we look at the guy on the left first, the guy on the left here, he's looking at a mono source. And when I say a mono source, what I mean is just a single point source of sound. It could be a radio, it could be a person speaking. But either way, that source of sound is directly in front of them. And even if this guy was blindfolded, he'd be able to tell that this was in front of them. And the way he does that is by comparing the level and the time of arrival difference of the sound at both of his ears. And because this sound object is directly in front of him, the sound takes a path which is equal for both ears. So in other words, when the sound arrives at his left ear, it's the same level and it arrives at the same time as the sound arriving at his right ear. So in that sense, you could say for this source that's directly in front of him that the sound has an equal time of arrival difference at both ears and an equal level difference at both ears. Now, if we move that source off to the right, or if he moves to the left, how does he know that it's off to the right? Well, in this case, the path of sound from the source to his right ear is going to be shorter than the path from the sound to his left ear. So what you get is, for his right ear, you get a higher level of sound. It hasn't traveled as far, so it's not as quiet, it's louder. And it arrives before the sound arriving in his left ear, which is comparably lower in level, and arrives later on. So what you can say, these two auditory localization cues, is that there are interaural time of arrival differences, which are IATDs, and interaural level differences. So this is how we distinguish the direction of sound. If I move on to the next slide. So now we've got, if we look on the left, we've got two sources now. And let's say these are identical sources. So this would be like a stereo system, for instance. And let's say that you put a CD in, you're listening to dialogue, just a guy speaking. So whatever sound is coming out of these speakers is identical for both of those speakers. Well, now what you find is that for the sound off to the one side, it's got IATDs and IALDs that are exactly opposite of the sound coming from the other side. Now, evolutionarily, I don't think there's going to be a case in nature when it would be beneficial for our ears to be able to discern between whether there's something in the middle or if there's two sound sources reproducing the same sound. And you can't really imagine a case in nature where you would ever get two sound sources reproducing exactly the same thing. You know, this is quite a recent construct that we've made this stereo system. It just doesn't happen outside of, like when you buy a stereo system. So evolutionarily, there'd be no reason for our brain to have to distinguish between two sources that are absolutely identical. And what happens is, even if you've got your eyes open, even if you're looking at the fact that you've got a stereo system in front of you, you still feel and perceive the image to be coming from between the two. And what this is called a phantom image. So that sound source obviously isn't there. And when you play a stereo system, you're imagining or kind of fabricating the image in your mind. So that's what happens there. And it happens because you get a central image because you've got equal and opposing interaural cues. If we go on to the right hand side of this slide now, either we've moved the stereo system slightly to the right or you've moved to the left. And in this case, you've got unequal IALDs and IATDs because one is directly in front of you and one's off to one side. So what happens now is not that your brain places the image in between the two still, so it's slightly off to the right. Your brain actually collapses the image into the nearer sound source. And I think this is also an evolutionary trait because if you think about it, if you've got two tigers and they're both making noise, the one that's going to be of a greater danger to you is the one that's closer, right? So what you find is that as soon as you move slightly off center from in between these two identical sources, your brain will collapse the image into the nearest speaker. And this is why stereo imaging is so fragile, and this is why it breaks down so easily, and why it is so heavily sweet spot dependent. So that's why I've drawn that little fluffy cloud. I've drawn that just in front of the left image, because it will collapse very severely down to the nearest source. And this is called Haas effect. All right, so now we know a little bit about how we kind of localize sound in the horizontal plane, at least. I'm going to talk about what mono, stereo, and surround sound is. So mono is very simple. It could have multiple drivers. So a driver is the small speaker unit that makes the sound itself, but essentially you've got one channel of audio in a mono system. That means that if we look at stereo, you've got two channels of audio, and they can be totally independent of one another. Most of the time they're not. There's a lot of similarity between two channels in a stereo system, but in a mono system you've got no option. You've just got one channel of audio, and you've got one speaker producing that, one speaker system at least reproducing that channel of audio. So you're gonna feel as if all the sound is coming from one place. It's always gonna sound like it's coming from that place, no matter where you are in the room. And it's gonna sound very boxy, and you're not gonna get any sense of space and envelopment, because again, it's from one single source. So that was simple. Moving on to stereo. So this is the sort of invention of stereo that Blumlein patented. And the idea is you've got two speakers that are angled or towed in to face the listener, and you're sat back to a distance at which you achieve 30 degrees off center for each loudspeaker, so 60 degrees spread in total. And in this case, you've got two channels instead of one with mono. You can still have multiple drivers in each of the speakers, but basically what stereo allows you to do is to pan virtual sources anywhere between the two speakers, relying on this psychoacoustic effect, whereby if information is shared between the two speakers, then we perceive the image to come from between them. So what you can do is very finely tweak either the time of arrival difference or the level difference between the speakers to kind of steer the sound in between those two speakers. So this is how you can achieve virtual sources between the two speakers, but they are virtual. Obviously, there's not an actual sound source there. You're listening to basically an illusion that your brain creates. So that's stereo in all its glory. Moving on to surround sound, the example I've got here is the most common, which is 5.1, 5 referring to the number of top channels you've got, so front, center, right, front, left, center, right, surround left and surround right, and then 0.1 referring to the LFE channel, or the low frequency effects channel. It's not quite a subwoofer, because you could actually have a subwoofer associated with each of these top units. But LFE is a particular channel referring to low frequency effects, which is commonly used in cinema. And obviously surround sound is primarily intended for people experiencing film rather than just enjoying music. You don't get that many instances where you'd encourage a listener to buy 5.1 purely for audio, although it does exist, of course. So what's good about this? Well, you've got a center channel, which is really good. So for anything that was going to rely with a stereo system on a phantom image in the center, you've now got a real source reproducing that sound. So that's a bonus. Anything else outside that front three, and even between those, the front left and the center and the front right, is going to be phantom imaging. So it's not going to be a real source. And you do get some kind of vague 360 feeling with the surround sound system. Even if you were to pan an image like all the way around that system, you would get some kind of vague imaging, but it would be very jumpy and very rough. In other words, like once you start going outside of that front quadrant, it's going to collapse very quickly into the surround left and very quickly into the surround right channels. And you're not going to get much behind your head either. But our ears are actually not very good at localizing stuff behind us anyway. I don't think there's that much else to say about surround sound now. You can have any combination of speakers you want, and it could be a surround sound system. You could have 22.2, you could have anything you want, as many top speakers as you want and so on, but this is obviously the most common instance of it. Most of the time for a 5.1 system, the surround channels are used to reproduce ambience rather than hard panned images. So if you're watching TV and there's actually the sound of a helicopter behind you, it can be quite distracting if the helicopter's not actually on screen. So most mix engineers choose not to use the surround channels for real sources anyway. They tend to use them for reverberance and background noise, and then anything that isn't background noise is actually placed in the front quadrant between those front three speakers as a phantom source. So if we go on to the next slide, what I've done is I've made a table here that could be quite useful to you guys, I'm not sure, but it certainly sums up the relative advantages and disadvantages of mono, stereo and surround. If we just go through them quite quickly, mono on the left, the great thing about mono is that there's no interference because you've only got a single source. Even though you've got multiple drivers and they will interact, of course they will, but the relative level of interference is quite low, which is really good. So you get clear reproduction of sound for anything that's coming out of that single source, assuming it's well designed, of course. You've also got stable single point localization regardless of the position in the room, so there's no sweet spot with the mono system. In other words, it doesn't matter where you are sitting in the room, you're still going to perceive the sound to be coming from that mono source in the middle. You're going to have problems with HF falling off, which is something we mentioned last week. Unless the sound has got good dispersion at all frequencies, as soon as you move off axis, it's going to start to sound dull and you're going to lose a lot of treble. And that's something that Orbit Sound products combat by having side speakers. I know they also help with the air sound. Well, that's why they're there. But it helps with the HF dispersion as well. So you're not going to get that with a mono system. Really, you could, but generally not. You're not going to get any directional imaging, so you can't use a mono system to place images anywhere. If you're a mix engineer, you're kind of stuck. Everything sounds like it's coming from one place. But other good things are there's no clutter. It's very easy to set up. You've got one box solution, and there's no sweet spot, as I said, and it's quite cost effective. Moving on to stereo, you do get interference with stereo because now you've got the combination of having multiple sources recreating the same thing, and the fact we've got two ears. So you've got sound from the left speaker arriving at both the right ear and the left ear at different times. And then you've got sound from the right speaker arriving at both the left ear and the right ear at different times. And that creates interference, which means that you lose a lot of mid-range. And remember last week we talked about the fact that our ears are most sensitive in our mid-range, in the mid-range frequencies. And the result of this is for any centrally panned images, say if you're watching a film with the stereo system and you've got dialogue being played, you'll find that the dialogue is not as clear as it could be. You'll get decent bass, decent treble, but in the mid-range it'll kind of sound a bit not very clear and distinct, so it won't sound crisp. You won't be able to understand what the speakers are saying as easily as you would in a mono system or a surround system, as we'll come on to. And this is one of the main benefits of Orbit Sound, because you've got that central source which is unaffected by any multiple sources. There's a problem with stereo, and you can measure that effect. You can see the effect of having a stereo system with two ears. You get this dipping around mid-range, which affects the reproduction. Other bad things about stereo: relies on phantom images. These images aren't real. Ghosts aren't real. So same thing. And the problem is as you start to move off axis, these phantom images collapse into the nearest speaker, and then you realise that you've lost what your brain's illusion was giving you. The phantom imaging breaks down severely off axis due to Haas effect. That's kind of the same thing as what I said. But the good thing is you can provide with stereo fairly reliably 60 degrees of localizable sound source positioning for centrally seated listeners. So they have to be sitting in the right place. And this is why the negative side is that it's sweet spot dependent. Moving on to surround sound, again, same as stereo, you've got loads of interference. You've got more interference arguably now because you've got multiple speakers combining with us having two ears. The good thing though is that surround systems have a central speaker, and that speaker is dedicated to important things like dialogue mainly. So when you're watching a film, you've got that central speaker reproducing on its own the dialogue and all the key centrally panned sources, and that means you haven't got any interference happening as you would with stereo. So you get nice clear spoken dialogue. It still relies on phantom imaging, so you're still going to get collapse into nearer speakers whether you move off axis or not. That's because of Haas effect again. One good thing is you do get a sense of envelopment, and you get some kind of localization over 360 degrees. So, if you do want a sense of ambience, you can achieve that with surround sound. It's a little bit of a kind of wrong tool for the job, because you need 5 speakers to start off with, and also the placement of them is such that it kind of collapses into the nearest speaker quite quickly. So you don't get a very good localization over 360 degrees, but you do get some localization. So not all lost. It is sweet spot dependent. Again, move off axis, the sound will sound like it's coming from either the left surround speaker or the right, and so on. And I think certainly one of the main turn-offs for most customers is that there's a lot of clutter, a lot of wires, complicated setup, takes up a lot of space and so on, and it's expensive. So that, I think, summarizes some of the things which are good and bad about these various systems. Laptop's frozen. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. I've listed some priorities for listeners, certainly as may be considered by customers. This isn't obviously my area, this is your area, but these are the ones that I would pick out and that I would consider as an audio engineer as well as a customer as being important when deciding between mono, stereo and surround system. And maybe if you don't know some of these words, or you don't use them, you might want to or whatever, but up to you guys. But anyway, what I've listed is envelopment. So that's the sense of being inside the sound and really feeling as if the sound's coming from everywhere, and I'm really immersed in that experience. I've got ambience, which is similar to envelopment, but again, it's the sense of having sound coming from all around me. I've got fidelity and balance of sound. So this is the idea that is your soundbar actually reproducing, or your system actually reproducing sound faithfully to the original recording. I've got stereo imaging and localization. We did tests at the University of Surrey, and we found that when we got tonmeisters in, they're the students, the sound engineering students, they were thinking, they were prioritizing stereo imaging quite highly because they do orchestral mix recordings and they want to be able to pinpoint violins are over here, cello are over here, and so on. They want to know where stuff is. So for some people this is important, having an ability to accurately localize sounds. Seating flexibility, is this system designed for one lonely man on his own, or is it a very social kind of system? Can I invite friends over and are they all going to get a good experience, or is it just for one guy sitting at home on his own? Ease of setup and cost. So what I've done on the next slide is I've put stars next to it. On the left hand side I've got gold stars for these are things that Orbit Sound products have. On the right hand side I've got things that either stereo or surround systems have, and if one or the other does not have it, it's a red cross. So envelopment, Orbit Sound products have it, and so do surround sound. Same for ambience. What I would say on this is the studies we did at the university, which were double-blind tests, they were quite scientific tests. Otherwise there wouldn't be any point in doing them. We could do non-scientific tests at home, but we did these scientific tests, and we found that Orbit Sound products actually came out on top. So even though both systems provided a sense of ambience, including surround sound and stereo systems, we found that Orbit Sound products had greater envelopment and greater ambience. Fidelity and balance of sound, well, I've got a smaller star for the surround sound and stereo products here because of that interference effect, and you do get a kind of a muddied dialogue, which is certainly prominent with a stereo system if it's not prominent for the surround system. So because you've got all these speakers reproducing sound, you get a lot of interference. And when I think about Dolby Atmos, for me it's the epitomization of a sort of capitalist attempt at making more money from something that isn't new. They've basically done surround sound on steroids. There's nothing new about Dolby Atmos. They've just done more speakers, and that's kind of it. It's like, well, what should we do for the next kind of generation of sound for cinema? Let's just do more of the same. So there's nothing really impressive there for me, and you get exactly the same problems, if not more problems, as a result of the fact that you've just got more speakers reproducing the same sounds. You're trying to pan them across a sphere now instead of just a horizontal plane, and you've got even more interference going on there. So I would say Orbit Sound products win in that regard. You've got less interference, you've got a better reproduction of the recording. Moving on to stereo imaging and localization. You get stereo imaging with Orbit Sound products. I would say it's not as strong as with a stereo system for someone sat in the sweet spot, but I would say that both surround sounds and stereo and Orbit Sound products provide some level of stereo imaging and localization. You probably could argue that the best system for localization would be surround sound. You've got the most flexibility there, but yeah, swings and roundabouts, I guess. Next point is seating flexibility. There's no real flexibility with surround or stereo systems. Your experience breaks down as soon as you move off center, so that's no good. Orbit Sound products, obviously you can sit wherever you like. Ease of setup, again, stereo system's not too bad, that's fine, but surround sound are hugely complicated if you compare it against an Orbit Sound product. And cost I've got here, obviously expensive to set up a surround sound system. So there's some sort of pros and cons to the different systems. The last thing I want to cover is lossless and lossy audio codecs. Codec just means coding, decoding, so it's kind of a portmanteau of those two words, and it describes anything that kind of takes it's called PCM. It's like an original recording and then codes it into a file format that is more manageable. So that's all the codec is. It's nothing more than a sort of a file format, really. For the sake of this, certainly. So I'm going to talk a bit about this. And I think the conclusion that we can take from this, or certainly the conclusion I take from this, is that high quality MP3s, high quality Ogg Vorbis, which is the codec that Spotify uses, or aptX, starts to become completely indistinguishable in terms of listening to it to CD quality, FLAC, or high definition. So it may sound a bit counterintuitive, and certainly for people who have a bit of a chip on their shoulder about always wanting the best, I would say, well, you know what, there's been no real test to show that you can really hear the difference between the highest quality MP3 and CD, for instance. And that's the point, right? We don't want a codec that can't be used to create a file space save and not be good quality. So that's what I would say on that. For Orbit Sound products, use the best quality MP3 or Ogg Vorbis streaming from Spotify or a lossless codec. And the reason for this will become clear in the last week. Orbit Sound products reproduce sound in a way that allows you to hear artifacts from encoding. And this is kind of a good thing, because you can really hear the quality of the audio with Orbit Sound products. So just to explain now, what are lossless and lossy audio codecs? So lossless codecs leave the quality and the information in the audio untouched. I put information in quotes. Information is the word I do mean to use, because you can kind of describe information, using the word information for anything that our brain uses to create an experience. So we've left the quality and information in the audio untouched with a lossless codec. And then we've encoded it in a way which saves a bit of file space. We won't be able to save anywhere near as much as if we use a lossy codec, but we've encoded it in a way that saves a little bit of space. So in this sense, there's no difference between FLAC and WAV. So you can't say what's better, FLAC or WAV. They're just different file formats for the same thing, basically. So if they're recorded at the same quality, it won't make a difference whether you listen to FLAC or WAV. Lossless codecs have much larger resulting file sizes than lossy codecs, so you might have an MP3 that's 3.5, 4 megabytes. The equivalent would be a 40 megabyte WAV file, so you're looking at 10 times the file size. They can be much larger than is audibly necessary. Just to go back to a point I made at the beginning, it was on Neil Young at the beginning in his Pono, or Pono, I don't know how you say it. But the idea is that there are now file formats and recording qualities that give you 192 kilohertz, for instance, 24-bit audio. This is kind of the highest one that I've seen commercially available. And CD, just to compare, is 44.1 kilohertz, 16-bit. So CD is significantly lower quality, at least insofar as how many samples it gives you per second and the resolution of those samples per second. But there's never been a test that reliably shows that people can hear the difference between the two. So CD still really is the benchmark, and when you think about Philips designing it, they didn't want to design a system which was okay but still not great quality. They wanted to design a system that was really what you needed. So they would have tried out more or less and worked out that 44.1K 16-bit audio is a real sweet spot. Examples of lossless codecs are CD, WAV, FLAC, 192K 24-bit, PCM. So that covers lossless, I think. Moving on to lossy codecs. This is the last slide, I think. So lossy codecs rely on removing what is not necessary from the audio in order to create the same experience. So we listen to an MP3 file and it sounds pretty much the same as a CD quality file, and the reason for this is because there are certain sounds that aren't necessary and we can't actually hear. To take a very obvious example, if someone's screaming at you and there's a mouse squeaking in another room, you might be able to hear that mouse if the guy wasn't screaming at you, but you can't because he's screaming at you. So this is an example of auditory masking, and there's a lot of that happens in audio. So when you're listening to your album, there's a lot of sound in there that is masked by other information or other sounds in that and that are being reproduced. So that's a really obvious one. And basically MP3s, for instance, rely on a psychoacoustic model to work out what sounds are going to be masked by others, what sounds our ears can't really hear, and start removing them from the audio. Obviously it gets to the point where you remove enough and you start to really hear it, and you get artifacts if you severely compress files with lossy codecs. One of them is called the birdies. You start to hear the birdies and you get this weird like high frequency tweeting sound, and as the high frequencies start to be degraded. So that would be just one example. But they are incredibly effective at reducing the file size. As I said, you could take a 40 megabyte file down to a 4 megabyte file. And when you think about it, that's a huge reduction in file size when you compare how much the quality actually changes. You might reduce the file size by 10 times, but the actual audio quality might stay at 99 or even 100% so far as you're concerned. So they are incredibly effective at doing this. We are more sensitive to noticing visual compression than audio compression, so if you start to reduce the quality of a video file, you'll notice it more quickly than you will for an audio file. I think this is, again, a combination of the fact that evolutionarily we're very sensitive to visual stuff, more sensitive than audio cues. In fact, often our visual cue will override our audio cues. Yeah, I think that's one thing. But the other thing is I don't think our video codecs are as well advanced as our audio codecs are. I've been placed on hold apparently. Am I back in? You guys hear me? Cool. Alright, so just some examples of lossy codecs are AAC, Advanced Audio Codec, MP3, OGG Vorbis, Bluetooth, SBC or aptX. The last one, Bluetooth, SBC or aptX, these are both Bluetooth codecs. So when you're streaming to a product with Bluetooth, you'll either be using SBC, which is subband coding. It's the very basic codec that Bluetooth has used for years, and it's still good quality, certainly at the top tier. But as the tiers, as you start to go down to high levels of compression, it really becomes audible. aptX sort of guarantees that the quality is going to be good. So whereas SBC will change the quality depending on the product you're streaming to, if a product is aptX enabled, it will always be the same aptX quality. And aptX really takes the quality to that point where it becomes indistinguishable from CD quality. So aptX is worth using if you've got it. Purely on the basis that it is consistent, whereas SBC can vary. I think that covers everything for this week. So if you post your questions on Slack, I'll answer them in line on the chat.